A love from chaos. Valentina's life had once been a dream of laughter and warmth. Her childhood home echoed with the chatter of her two younger brothers, their mischievous giggles blending with her mother's melodic humming as she prepared meals in their sunlit kitchen. Her father had been a pillar of strength, a man she had once admired for his steady guidance and boundless optimism. But when his company collapsed under the weight of a failing economy, everything crumbled. The once proud man retreated into the shadows of his shame, drowning his failure in endless bottles of whiskey and the false hope of late-night poker games. The laughter in the house turned to whispers of worry, the warmth replaced by a chilling despair. Bills went unpaid, their possessions slowly disappearing to pay off mounting debts. Her mother's hums were replaced by quiet sobs late into the night, and Valentina found herself assuming the role of caretaker for her brothers, trying to shield them from the storm. As the debts piled higher, their family's desperation became a beacon for predators lurking in the shadows of the underworld. The men who finally came knocking didn't just demand payment. They brought with them the weight of a choice that would shatter Valentina's world forever. The night it all changed began like any other. Valentina was helping her brothers with their homework, trying to shield them from the chaos that had engulfed their lives. The sharp knock at the door startled her, and a chill raced down her spine. Her father's haggard face turned pale as he opened the door to reveal three imposing men. Their cold eyes scanned the room before settling on him. "Time's up," one of them growled. Her father stammered, desperate and trembling. "Please, just a little more time, I can get the money." The tallest man sneered. "You've had enough time, the boss doesn't like waiting. You don't have the money and your house isn't worth enough. What else do you have to offer?" he demanded, his voice like a blade. The man's gaze shifted to Valentina, appraising her coldly. "Her," he said, the single word dripping with menace. "She'll settle the debt." Valentina's heart stopped. "What?" she gasped, disbelief and betrayal coursing through her. She looked to her father, her voice trembling with desperation. "You're not going to let them do this, are you?" Her father's face crumpled, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his shame. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The men's cold, calculating eyes flicked between father and daughter, enjoying the torment. "Time to decide," the tallest man sneered, his tone mocking. "You either pay up or we take her. The boss doesn't wait for charity cases." Her father's trembling hand gripped the back of a chair, his knuckles white. Valentina's heart pounded as she watched him, her mind racing between anger and disbelief. "You can't just stand there," she cried, her voice breaking. "Say something. Stop them." Her father's lips moved, but no words came. A single tear rolled down his cheek as he looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of shame and helplessness. His silence pierced her more deeply than any words could have. She felt the weight of betrayal pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. The men exchanged smirks, enjoying the scene. The tallest one leaned in closer to her father. "Well, what's it going to be?" Valentina's hands clenched into fists, her legs trembling beneath her. "You're my father," she whispered, the words carrying a mixture of disbelief and devastation. "How could you let this happen?" Her father's hand slipped from the chair, falling limply to his side as he turned his face away. It was the final blow, shattering whatever fragile hope she had left. Finally, he managed, "Please, there must be another way. She's just a girl. Only 18. The man's cruel grin widened. "Exactly why she's perfect. Young, beautiful, worth every cent you owe and more." Valentina's stomach churned as the implication hit her like a sledgehammer. She shook her head violently, backing away as the men advanced, their dark intentions clear. Her father's silence stretched unbearably, a shattering betrayal that left her defenseless. Without another word, the men seized her arms, ignoring her screams and frantic struggles as they dragged her toward the door. Her father remained rooted to the spot, his face buried in his hands, as her cries echoed into the night. He couldn't even meet her eyes as they dragged her out into the cold night. The mansion she was taken to reeked of opulence and decay. Gold-lined furniture stood in stark contrast to the stench of sweat and despair that permeated the air. The carpets were thick and ornate, but they couldn't mask the underlying filth of the place. As she was dragged through the hallways, Valentina's wide, fearful eyes darted around, taking in the grotesque grandeur that only deepened her dread. At last they brought her before Igor. The bloated, leering man sat sprawled on a crimson velvet armchair, a glass of amber liquid in one hand, and a cigar in the other. His heavy-lidded eyes raked over her with a predatory grin, and she recoiled instinctively. "This is her?" Igor's voice was a guttural rumble, thick with disdain and amusement. He motioned lazily for his men to bring her closer. "Please," Valentina whispered, her voice trembling, "you don't have to do this." Igor let out a harsh laugh, the sound grating and cruel. "Oh, sweet girl, you think you're in a position to make requests? Your father's debt is my property now, and so are you." She swallowed hard, her stomach churning. "My father, he'll pay you back. Just give him more time." "Time?" Igor sneered, taking a long drag from his cigar, before exhaling a cloud of smoke in her direction. "I've given that worthless man enough time. He's a failure. But you, my dear, you might actually be worth something." Valentina tried to pull away, but the men holding her tightened their grip. Her heart pounded as Igor stood, his bloated frame looming over her. "Take her to the main bedroom," he ordered, his tone dismissive. "Chain her up. I'll deal with her later." Her captors dragged her away despite her frantic struggles. Her screams echoed through the mansion, but they only seemed to amuse Igor and his men. Once in the grand bedroom, they secured her to the bed with heavy iron chains. The room's opulence, its gilded mirrors and plush bedding, only added to her sense of violation. Left alone, Valentina's spirit battled against the despair threatening to consume her. She clenched her fists, vowing to herself that she would survive this, no matter the cost. For days she endured his lecherous gaze and the mocking laughter of his guards. But Igor's arrogance led to his downfall. He had begun encroaching on the territory of a ruthless mafia boss named Tony De Luca. Tony's name was whispered with a mix of fear and reverence. He ruled with an iron fist, his empire vast and his reputation merciless. When Igor's men raided one of Tony's warehouses, the retaliation was swift. Tony stood amidst the wreckage of Igor's estate, his piercing gray eyes scanning the devastation. The acrid stench of smoke and blood filled the air, mingling with the sharp metallic tang of spent bullets. Shattered furniture and splintered wood littered the marble floors, their once grand appearance reduced to chaos. The distant sound of muffled cries and hurried footsteps echoed as his men searched for survivors and evidence of Igor's operations. The walls bore scorch marks from gunfire, and broken glass crunched beneath Tony's boots as he moved through the destruction. His jaw tightened as his gaze fell on the remnants of what had once been Igor's lavish life, symbols of greed and cruelty that only fueled his anger. He clenched his fists, the images of those imprisoned here flashing through his mind. This wasn't just a victory, it was a reckoning. And as the rain began to drizzle through the gaping holes in the roof, Tony vowed there would be no place for men like Igor in his world. His men had stormed the mansion, tearing through Igor's defenses like a hurricane. The stench of blood and gunpowder filled the air. In the basement, they had found rows of prisoners, their faces etched with relief as they were freed. But it was the discovery in the master bedroom that made Tony's blood boil. Valentina lay chained to the bed, her wrists bruised and her cheeks streaked with tears. She flinched as Tony approached, her wide brown eyes filled with terror. "Don't hurt me, please," she whispered, her voice trembling. Tony's expression softened just slightly. "I'm not here to hurt you, my name is Tony. I'm getting you out of here." He gestured to one of his men who quickly unlocked the chains. Valentina collapsed into his arms, too weak to stand. As Tony lifted her effortlessly, cradling her as though she were made of glass, an unexpected pang struck him. Her frailty, the haunted look in her wide brown eyes and the soft curve of her lips, ignited something he hadn't felt in years. It was as though the chaos around them melted away, and for a moment, he was captivated by her. The sight of her bruised wrists and tear-streaked cheeks filled him with an overwhelming sense of anger, not just at Igor, but at himself for not doing this sooner. Yet amidst the fury, he couldn't deny the strange magnetic pull she had over him. It was as if he'd been struck by lightning, an unshakable certainty settling in his chest that he had to protect her at all costs. He carried her out of that wretched place, the chaos of his men's cleanup fading into the background, his mind consumed by the delicate woman in his arms who had already begun to unravel his carefully constructed walls. Back at Tony's estate, Valentina was carried into a luxurious guest room, her frail body barely responsive. A doctor was called immediately, his expression darkening as he examined her. "She's malnourished," he informed Tony grimly. "Starved, dehydrated, and hasn't seen daylight in days. If you'd arrived any later, it might have been too late." Tony's jaw tightened, the icy rage in his eyes betraying his otherwise calm exterior. Inside his mind raced, a tempest of worry. He replayed the moment he had found her, chained and broken, her hollow gaze haunting him. The bruises on her wrists, the unnatural pallor of her skin, they were all reminders of how close she had come to slipping away. "Do what you need to, just make sure she recovers," he said, his voice firm, but laced with an undercurrent of desperation. As the doctor left to gather supplies, Tony remained by her side, his eyes fixed on her fragile form. A rare pang of self-doubt gnawed at him. She looked so small, so vulnerable, yet something in her quiet resilience struck a chord deep within him. Her strength, even in her broken state, was unlike anything he'd ever encountered. He reached out hesitantly, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "You're safe now," he murmured softly, though the words felt inadequate against the weight of his emotions. Over the next few days, the staff tended to her carefully, bringing her warm meals and soft clothes. At first, Valentina couldn't bring herself to accept their kindness. The steaming bowls of soup and plush blankets felt almost foreign after weeks of cold, stale bread and damp darkness. She flinched when hands reached toward her, expecting roughness instead of the gentleness they offered. Each act of care chipped away at her defenses, the housekeeper's soft voice as she adjusted Valentina's pillows, the doctor's patient reassurance as he examined her bruises, and even the subtle way the guards outside her room stood a little taller when Tony passed by. All of it stirred something fragile within her. She sat on the edge of the bed one afternoon, staring at a bowl of warm stew in her lap. For the first time in weeks, she felt the faintest flicker of safety. It unnerved her, this contrast between the squalor she had endured and the quiet comfort surrounding her now. Yet she couldn't deny the pull of something hopeful taking root in her heart. Though her physical wounds began to heal, her spirit remained guarded. The pristine walls of Tony's mansion, with its gleaming marble and immaculate decor, felt alien to her after the squalor she'd endured. Yet the looming presence of its owner, who visited her daily, intrigued and unsettled her in equal measure. One evening, as she sat on the edge of her bed, Tony entered, his expression unreadable. "You're looking better," he remarked, his voice low but steady. She met his gaze, her eyes wary. "Why are you doing this?" He leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. "Because no one deserves what Igor did to you, and because I can." Her lip trembled, the raw vulnerability she'd tried to bury surfacing. "You should have left me. There's nothing for me to go back to. My father sold me to pay off his debts." Tony's expression hardened, though his tone remained calm. "Then you'll stay here until you decide what's next. But know this, you're not a debt to me. You're free to leave whenever you're ready." Her walls faltered for a moment as his words sank in. For the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of safety, though the road to trust would be long and fraught. Slowly she began to trust him, though she remained guarded. Tony was a man of contradictions. He was ruthless in business, his enemies meeting gruesome fates. Yet with her, he was patient, almost gentle. He never pushed, never demanded more than she was willing to give. At first, Valentina couldn't make sense of the feelings stirring within her. Tony's calm strength, the way he looked at her with a rare softness, made her chest tighten in ways she wasn't prepared for. When he spoke, his voice carried a warmth she doubted anyone else had ever experienced. And yet, for every kind word or fleeting smile, a shadow of doubt crept into her mind. She couldn't shake the gnawing thought that she wasn't enough, not for a man like him. Tony moved through life with unshakable confidence, commanding respect and fear in equal measure. What could someone like her, broken and scarred, possibly offer him? These thoughts kept her up at night, twisting the beginnings of hope into anguish. One evening after Tony had returned from a long day of meetings, she found herself lingering in the study doorway. He glanced up from his desk, his sharp features softening as he saw her. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice low and inviting. She hesitated, her fingers brushing against the door frame. "Why are you so kind to me?" she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. Tony leaned back in his chair, studying her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Why wouldn't I be? You've been through enough. You deserve kindness, Valentina." She shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "But I'm just damaged. You could have anyone, someone who's strong, who hasn't—" Her voice faltered, unable to finish the sentence. Tony stood, crossing the room in a few strides until he was standing before her. He tilted her chin up gently, forcing her to meet his piercing gaze. "You're stronger than you think. You survived what most couldn't. Don't ever call yourself damaged again." His words were like a balm to her wounded soul, but her heart remained conflicted. As his hand lingered, the warmth of his touch sent a spark through her. She longed to believe him, to let herself imagine a future where someone like Tony could truly care for her. But the scars of her past were deep, and the fear of not being enough lingered still. One stormy night, Valentina's nightmares dragged her from sleep. Memories of Igor's leer, the cold metal of the chains, and her father's betrayal haunted her. She wandered the halls, seeking solace. She found Tony in his study, a glass of whiskey in his hand and a contemplative look on his face. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. She shook her head, wrapping her arms around herself. He gestured for her to sit, and she hesitated before perching on the edge of the leather couch. They sat in silence for a while, the rain pounding against the windows. "Do you hate your father?" Tony asked suddenly. The question caught her off guard. She had thought about it countless times, her emotions a tangled mess of anger, sadness, and betrayal. "I don't know," she admitted. "I hate what he did, but he's still my father. It's complicated." Tony nodded as if he understood. Family is always complicated. She looked at him, curiosity outweighing her caution. "Do you have family?" His jaw tightened and he took a sip of his whiskey. "Not anymore." The sadness in his voice surprised her. For the first time, she saw a crack in the armor of the fearsome mafia boss. He was human, after all. As the weeks passed, their bond deepened. Tony began sharing pieces of his past, his rise to power, the betrayals that had shaped him, and the loneliness that came with his position. Valentina, in turn, opened up about her dreams, her fears, and the pain of her father's actions. One evening, as they walked through the gardens, Tony stopped abruptly. He turned to her, his gray eyes intense. "You don't belong in this world, Valentina. You deserve a life far away from all of this." She frowned. "And where would I go? Back to a family that sold me? A world that's already forgotten me?" Tony reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek. You're stronger than you realize. But if you stay here, you'll never have a chance to find out who you truly are. Her heart ached at his words. She knew he was right, yet the thought of leaving him filled her with a strange sense of loss. Against all odds, she had found safety with him. And maybe, just maybe, something more. The tension between them finally reached its breaking point one fateful night. Tony returned from a meeting. He was soaking wet from the rain, his shirt stained with blood and his expression dark. Valentina was waiting for him, worry etched across her face. "Are you hurt?" she asked, stepping closer. "It's not my blood," he replied, his voice cold. She placed a hand on his arm, grounding him. "Tony, you can't keep doing this. It's going to destroy you." His gaze softened as he looked at her. "It's the only life I know." "Then let me show you something different," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. He hesitated for a heartbeat, his storm-gray eyes searching hers for permission, for a sign that she felt the same pull that had consumed him since the moment he found her. She nodded ever so slightly, and that was all it took. Tony closed the distance, his lips capturing hers in a searing kiss that spoke of desperation, longing, and an unspoken promise of protection. For Tony, the world seemed to still, the weight of his sins and past lifting for the briefest moment. For Valentina, the kiss was an anchor, grounding her in the present and silencing the doubts that had plagued her since her life had fallen apart. It was a meeting of two broken souls, each finding solace in the other's touch, and for the first time hope felt within reach. It was a collision of desperation and longing, their walls crumbling in the face of the undeniable connection between them. For a moment, the storm outside seemed to echo the chaos within their hearts, the thunder and lightning a reflection of the intensity between them. When they finally broke apart, Tony rested his forehead against hers, his breath unsteady. "Valentina," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You've changed something in me. I don't know how to go back to who I was before you." She cupped his face with trembling hands, her own emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "I'm scared, Tony," she admitted, tears brimming in her eyes. "But with you, for the first time, I feel like I could be whole again." Tony pulled her closer, wrapping her in his arms as if shielding her from the world. "Then stay," he whispered. "Not because you're bound to me, but because you choose to. Let's build something new together, something better." In that moment, Valentina knew her life would never be the same. The scars of her past hadn't vanished, but they felt lighter, as though sharing them with Tony had made them easier to bear. And as she looked into his storm-gray eyes, she saw not just a man hardened by the world, but someone who could love her for all that she was and all that she could become. Their story wasn't perfect, nor was it easy, but it was theirs. Together, they stepped forward into an uncertain future, bound by a love that had grown in the unlikeliest of places.